When the game ends, the silence begins, and in that silence, truth finally speaks. There comes a moment when the empath, the one who has given endlessly, who has understood too deeply, who has bent until breaking, decides enough. And that moment, oh, that moment is the most terrifying sound the narcissist will ever hear. It's not a scream, not an argument, not a door slammed in fury. It's the calm, resolute silence of someone who has awakened. The empath has stopped playing along. For so long, the narcissist danced in the center of attention, feeding on validation, control, and admiration like oxygen. They built their sense of power on the empathy of another. Every manipulation, every guilt trip, every false promise, it all depended on one thing, that the empath would keep responding, that the empath would keep explaining, forgiving, believing there was still something worth saving. But what happens when that belief dies? What happens when the empath, light, once used to illuminate the narcissist's shadow, finally turns inward? Silence is power. It's a truth most people don't understand until they experience it firsthand, especially those who have lived under the emotional gravity of a narcissist. For the empath, silence doesn't begin as a choice, it begins as a necessity, as an act of self-preservation. There comes a point when words no longer heal, explanations no longer reach, and compassion becomes ammunition in the wrong hands. That's the moment the empath realizes that the most powerful response isn't reaction, it's quiet detachment, and that silence, that stillness that once felt so uncomfortable, becomes the strongest weapon they will ever wield. When an empath stops explaining, something shifts in the energy dynamic. Narcissists thrive on reaction because every reaction, whether it's love, anger, or pain, confirms that they still have emotional control. They don't care if the emotion is positive or negative. All that matters is that it revolves around them. Every message, every tear, every attempt to be understood feeds their sense of importance. They need engagement like a plant needs sunlight, but silence cuts that supply. Silence says, I no longer play this game. And that single act, without a word spoken, dismantles the narcissist's illusion of dominance more completely than any confrontation ever could. In silence, the empath withdraws their energy. They stop being a mirror for the narcissist's ego and begin reflecting inward instead. At first, the narcissist will panic, then provoke, then plead. They'll test the empath's boundaries, throwing every familiar trick into the mix: guilt, blame, gaslighting, or false affection. They'll try to stir any emotional response because to them, any reaction means survival. But when the empath remains unmoved, when they stop defending, stop explaining, stop reacting, the narcissist is forced into an unfamiliar confrontation with their own emptiness. That's the power of silence. It exposes what noise always concealed. The narcissist can no longer manipulate emotions that aren't being offered. They can't distort conversations that aren't happening. And most painfully for them, they can't validate themselves through someone else's energy anymore. The mirror they once depended on is gone, and what remains is their own reflection, unfiltered, unflattering, and unavoidable. For the empath, silence becomes the space where healing begins, because every word once used to justify, to calm, or to please was energy spent trying to manage someone else's dysfunction. Silence reclaims that energy. It creates distance from chaos and invites clarity to return. The empath begins to see how often they confuse communication with connection, how often they mistook patience for progress. They start realizing that not everyone deserves access to their understanding, but silence isn't passive. It's active power disguised as stillness. It says, I see your pattern and I refuse to feed it. It's not about revenge or punishment. It's about protection. It's about realizing that peace is not found in fixing someone else, but in refusing to be broken by them. It's an invisible boundary that says, you no longer have access to my mind or my emotions. Of course, the narcissist interprets silence as the ultimate insult. They'll twist it, tell others the empath is cold, cruel, or heartless. They'll paint themselves as the victim to regain sympathy from new audiences. But deep down, they know the truth. The silence means they've lost control, because power over someone only exists when that person keeps responding. And when that response disappears, so does the illusion of control. For the empath, silence also reveals something deeper: Trust. When you no longer rush to explain your truth, it means you finally believe it. When you stop trying to convince others of your worth, it means you've recognized it. Silence then becomes not just resistance, but confidence. It's a language of certainty, one that says, I don't need to prove who I am anymore. In that stillness, the empath rediscovers peace. The mind that once raced to anticipate manipulation now rests. The heart that once beat with anxiety learns a steady rhythm again. The absence of chaos reveals how loud peace can actually be. And slowly, the empath realizes that silence isn't empty. It's full of strength, full of wisdom, full of self-respect. Meanwhile, the narcissist grows restless. Without reaction, they have nowhere to project their chaos. They try to replace the empath with others, hoping to replicate that same energy, but it never feels the same. The more they chase control, the more powerless they feel. Because silence doesn't just end a relationship, it ends a cycle. It ends the energy exchange that sustained the manipulation. And without that exchange, the narcissist's mask begins to crumble faster than ever before. Silence is not absence. It's presence, but redirected. It's the empath choosing themselves over the need to be understood. It's an act of courage, because silence often feels like abandonment to those who have spent their lives caring for others. But in truth, it's the highest form of self-care. It's choosing peace over chaos, growth over guilt, healing over habit. In time, the empath sees that silence doesn't just protect them, it transforms them. It turns pain into wisdom, confusion into clarity, heartbreak into strength. It teaches them that not every battle needs to be fought aloud. Some victories are won in the quiet, where the noise of manipulation can no longer reach. So when the empath stops speaking, stops explaining, stops playing along, it isn't surrender, it's revolution. It's the sound of chains breaking, the echo of freedom beginning. The narcissist may see silence as rejection, but the empath knows it's resurrection. It's not the end of their story, it's the beginning of their power. That's why silence, when chosen with intention, becomes the loudest statement of all. It says everything words never could. I am no longer available for pain. I am no longer part of your play. I choose peace. And in that single, steady act of stillness, the empath doesn't just take their power back. They reclaim their entire life. When the empath stops feeding the narcissist's constant need for validation, something profound happens. The mask begins to crack. Narcissists live for admiration, attention, and control. Their entire sense of identity depends on how others see them. They are actors on a stage built from other people's reactions. Without an audience, the performance collapses. When the empath walks away or stops playing along, the narcissist is suddenly stripped of the one thing they cannot survive without: external affirmation. And in that absence, their carefully constructed image begins to fall apart, piece by piece. For so long, the narcissist has lived behind the mask, confident, charming, in control, but that persona is fragile. It isn't built on truth or strength, it's built on validation borrowed from others. The empath, with their deep emotional understanding, has always been the perfect mirror. They reflect back the narcissist's desired image, making them feel important, admired, and powerful. But the narcissist never loves the empath for who they are. They love them for how well they mirror what the narcissist wants to see. It's not a relationship, it's a transaction. The empath gives energy, emotion, and attention. The narcissist takes it and transforms it into their self-worth. When that mirror suddenly disappears, the narcissist is left facing something they've avoided their entire life: themselves. Without admiration to inflate them, without attention to distract them, they start to feel the emptiness they've been running from. It's a terrifying experience, one they're ill-equipped to handle. Their entire existence revolves around avoiding vulnerability. They've built layers of grandiosity and control to keep their insecurities hidden, but when the empath's validation is gone, the cracks in their armor widen. The confident exterior begins to crumble, revealing insecurity, jealousy, and fear underneath. At first, the narcissist reacts with confusion. They wonder why their usual tactics no longer work. They reach for manipulation, guilt, or anger to regain control. When that fails, they panic. Without someone to reflect their importance, they start to feel insignificant. Their energy shifts from arrogance to desperation. They may try to idealize the empath again, offering false promises or pretending to have changed, all to lure them back into the cycle. But it isn't love driving them. It's survival. They're not seeking connection. They're seeking a source of emotional supply to keep their ego alive. The unraveling continues as the narcissist realizes the empath's silence isn't temporary. For the first time, they experience a loss they cannot control. The empathy they once exploited is gone, replaced with detachment. That detachment is more powerful than any confrontation because it reveals the narcissist's truth. They were never as powerful as they believed. Their confidence was dependent on another's reaction. Their strength was an illusion built on someone else's sensitivity. Without that emotional fuel, their false sense of superiority collapses like a house of cards. This unraveling is emotional starvation for the narcissist. They've built their entire world around being seen, admired, and desired. When that stops, they feel invisible. But instead of reflecting inward to heal, they often lash out or seek another empath to replace the first. They move from person to person, desperately searching for that same level of devotion, that same emotional richness that once kept them alive. But it never feels the same because what they crave isn't real love, it's control. And once you've lost control over someone who truly saw through you, you never forget that loss. The narcissist's mask, which once seemed flawless, now begins to slip in front of others too. The cracks that were once hidden behind charm start showing through in arrogance, frustration, and paranoia. Their ability to maintain the illusion weakens because the emotional stability the empath once provided is no longer there to balance them. The more they try to project confidence, the more transparent their insecurity becomes. Without the empath's quiet nurturing and emotional regulation, they become restless and unstable. They begin to expose their true nature to others, the very thing they've always feared. What's most ironic is that the empath's absence reveals more truth about the narcissist than their presence ever could. When the empath was there, the narcissist's mask stayed intact. The empath's patience and understanding covered the narcissist's chaos, making them appear composed. But once that steady energy is gone, their true nature surfaces, brittle, insecure, and emotionally hollow. They can no longer maintain the facade of superiority because there's no one left to believe in it. This moment, while painful for both, is transformative for the empath. Watching the narcissist's mask crack isn't about revenge, it's about revelation. The empath finally sees that what they once admired was never real power, only performance. They realize that the person they tried so hard to heal was someone too afraid to face their own pain. And that understanding gives the empath closure, not because the narcissist apologized or changed, but because the illusion is gone. For the narcissist, however, this unraveling marks the beginning of their downfall. Without a steady source of admiration, they become emotionally disoriented. They may try to recreate their mask with new people, but each attempt feels emptier than the last. Every new relationship becomes shorter, more chaotic, more transparent. The charm fades faster because the mask, once held together by the empath's energy, no longer fits. The tragedy is that the narcissist rarely learns from this. Instead of facing the truth, they blame the empath, accusing them of betrayal or coldness. But deep down, they know the truth. They lost the only person who ever truly saw them. The person who offered unconditional understanding walked away, and they have no one to blame but themselves. So when the empath stops feeding the illusion, the narcissist doesn't just lose a person, they lose their reflection. The mask that once made them feel powerful now feels heavy and hollow. And while the empath walks toward healing, the narcissist is left chasing ghosts of validation, forever searching for a mirror that can make them feel real again. That's the moment the mask doesn't just crack, it shatters. And the sound of that shattering is the echo of a truth the narcissist can no longer escape without the empath's light. Their shadow can no longer hide. When the empath finally awakens, the world they once saw through the eyes of compassion and hope suddenly looks different. The same patterns that once felt confusing now make perfect sense. The endless cycles of apology and manipulation, the way they were made to doubt their own worth, the exhaustion that never seemed to leave, it all starts to connect. This awakening isn't a single moment of clarity, it's a gradual realization that who they were becoming under the narcissist's influence was a dimmed version of who they truly are. The empath's awakening is transformation, raw, painful, but ultimately liberating. For so long, the empath believed that their love could heal. They thought that if they were just patient enough, kind enough, forgiving enough, the narcissist would finally change. Every act of compassion felt like an investment in a better version of the other person, but that hope was built on illusion. The narcissist never wanted healing, they wanted control. And every time the empath tried to help, they unknowingly gave more of themselves away. It takes hitting emotional exhaustion to realize that love should never require self-erasure. The awakening begins when the empath understands that what they've been calling love has really been survival. This transformation is not quiet or easy. It's a process of peeling away everything false that was layered over the empath's true self. At first, the realization is painful. They look back and see how much they tolerated, how often they explained, how deeply they bent just to avoid breaking the connection. There's grief in that recognition, grief for the time lost, for the love misplaced, for the self abandoned. But grief, when met with awareness, becomes power. It's through that pain that the empath begins to rebuild from within, not from a place of guilt or shame, but from strength and truth. The empath's awakening is not about revenge or proving the narcissist wrong. It's about reclaiming themselves. They start setting boundaries where they once gave excuses. They begin saying no without explaining why. They stop engaging in emotional games that lead nowhere. Each small act of self-respect feels foreign at first, almost uncomfortable because they've been conditioned to associate peace with guilt. But over time, those small acts add up. The empath begins to see that every boundary is not a rejection of others, it's an affirmation of self-worth. As the empath transforms, their energy shifts. The same sensitivity that once made them a target now becomes their superpower. They learn to read energy without absorbing it, to care without losing themselves in someone else's chaos. They begin to understand that empathy isn't about saving everyone. It's about recognizing who is ready to be helped and who is only looking to drain. Their heart doesn't harden, it becomes wise. Their compassion doesn't fade, it evolves. It becomes grounded, discerning, self-respecting. The narcissist often mistakes this transformation as coldness, but it's not coldness, it's clarity. The empath no longer seeks approval or validation. They no longer try to explain their feelings to people committed to misunderstanding them. Instead, they start living authentically, not for the applause of others, but for the peace of their own spirit. What once triggered them now only teaches them. What once broke them now builds them. And as the empath grows, something powerful happens. They stop attracting pain. They stop mistaking intensity for love. They start recognizing red flags, not as challenges to fix, but as signs to walk away. Their energy becomes too balanced for manipulation to take root. They begin to attract relationships that reflect their growth, connections built on respect, mutual understanding, and genuine care. They no longer crave chaos because they've tasted peace, and once peace becomes familiar, chaos loses its charm. This is what transformation looks like. It's not loud or dramatic. It's steady, intentional, and deeply empowering. The empath stops identifying as a victim and begins to see themselves as a survivor, then as a creator of their own reality. They realize they don't need to seek love. They are love. They don't need to prove their worth. It has always been there, waiting beneath the layers of manipulation and self-doubt. As the empath continues to rise, the narcissist watches with confusion and resentment. The person they once controlled now moves with quiet confidence. Their silence no longer feels like fear. It radiates strength. Their distance is not weakness, it's wisdom. The narcissist may try to return, sensing the loss of their supply, but they find the empath different now, emotionally untouchable. What once worked no longer does because the empath has changed from within. This transformation doesn't mean the empath forgets what happened. It means they finally understand it. They see the lessons behind the pain, the growth behind the betrayal, the purpose behind the loss. They begin to thank the experience, not for the suffering it caused, but for the strength it revealed. That's the beauty of an empath's awakening. It turns wounds into wisdom. In this new chapter, the empath no longer looks back with longing or anger. They move forward with grace. Their heart remains open, but their standards rise. They understand now that love without respect is an empty promise, that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. They learn that peace is not the absence of love, it's the foundation of it. The empath's awakening is transformation because it's the rebirth of truth. It's the moment they stop seeking light in others and realize they were the light all along. They stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And start saying, I am enough. That single shift changes everything. They rise, not bitter, not broken, but beautifully aware. They rise with wisdom in their heart, strength in their soul, and a quiet knowing that they will never again dim their light to make someone else comfortable in their darkness. That is the power of an empath transformed. Indifference is the antidote to manipulation. It's the one reaction that the narcissist cannot use, cannot twist, and cannot feed on. For as long as the empath reacts, whether with love, anger, sadness, or even explanation, the narcissist feels alive. Every emotion given, every attempt to reason, every plea for understanding becomes a threat of control. It doesn't matter if the reaction is positive or negative. What matters is that it keeps the narcissist at the center of attention. That is their source of power. But when the empath finally learns the art of indifference, when their emotions stop orbiting around the narcissist's chaos, everything begins to change. The very foundation of manipulation crumbles, because manipulation cannot survive where there is no emotional response. The empath's journey toward indifference doesn't happen overnight. It begins after countless cycles of hope and disappointment, after realizing that no matter how calmly they speak or how clearly they explain, the narcissist only hears what serves their ego. The empath starts to see that engaging in arguments or justifications is like trying to reason with a storm. Every word is swept away, distorted, and thrown back as ammunition. That's when the empath starts withdrawing their energy, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. They realize that their emotional investment has been the lifeline keeping the manipulation alive. Indifference is not hatred, it's neutrality. It's the quiet power of no longer caring about the outcome of the narcissist's behavior. It's the realization that their words no longer hold meaning, their reactions no longer define worth, and their approval no longer determines peace. When the empath reaches this point, they are no longer playing the narcissist's game. And that's precisely what makes it so powerful, because the narcissist's control depends entirely on the game continuing. Without participation, there's no fuel, no drama, no validation. At first, the narcissist doesn't understand what's happening. They sense something is different. The empath isn't responding the way they used to. Their usual triggers fall flat. They try harder, pushing buttons, throwing emotional bombs. But the empath's calm doesn't waver. That calm infuriates the narcissist because it represents freedom. The empath is no longer emotionally accessible, and to the narcissist that feels like rejection of their very existence. They'll try to provoke, accusing, insulting, or even pretending to be the victim, but the empath's indifference is a mirror that reflects nothing back. It leaves the narcissist standing alone in their own noise. For the empath, indifference is not cold-heartedness, it's self-protection. It's learning to detach from the illusion that they owe someone endless forgiveness or understanding. It's realizing that no amount of explaining will ever make someone see who is determined to misunderstand. Indifference is a boundary without words. It's a silent declaration that says, "You no longer have access to my emotions." And in that silence, the empath begins to breathe freely again. There's something incredibly peaceful about reaching the stage of indifference. It's the moment when emotional triggers lose their power, when chaos no longer feels familiar or tempting. The empath no longer feels the urge to prove, to fix, or to defend. They stop giving their energy to situations that drain them and start investing it into themselves. Indifference, then, becomes not just a defense mechanism, it becomes a lifestyle of peace. It teaches the empath to prioritize calm over closure, self-worth over validation, and freedom over control. The narcissist, however, experiences this shift as an existential threat. Their ego feeds on reaction, and indifference feels like starvation. They'll cycle through their familiar tactics: love bombing, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, anything to get a rise. But the empath's silence becomes a wall they cannot climb. Every time they try to manipulate, the energy just falls flat, absorbed by the empath's calm. The narcissist starts to unravel, desperate to be seen, desperate to matter. But the more desperate they become, the more invisible they feel, because indifference removes their audience. It's in this phase that the empath realizes just how much control they actually have. For years, they believed the narcissist was the powerful one, the manipulator, the puppeteer. But true power was never in control. It was in emotion. The empath's heart, their ability to care deeply, was the very thing that sustained the manipulation. Once that care is redirected inward, once it no longer fuels the narcissist's ego, the entire dynamic ends. The narcissist cannot manipulate what no longer reacts. Indifference also brings clarity. When the empath no longer reacts emotionally, they begin to see patterns that were once blurred by confusion and guilt. They recognize how manipulation worked not as magic, but as a system that depended on their empathy. They begin to see through the false apologies, the exaggerated emotions, the fake remorse. What once looked like passion or love now appears as control. And in that realization, emotional attachment dissolves naturally. Indifference is born not out of spite, but out of wisdom. Over time, this state of neutrality becomes the empath's strength. They stop giving the narcissist the satisfaction of their emotional energy, and in doing so, they reclaim their peace. They begin to live again, lightly, freely, without the constant weight of someone else's mood dictating their own. They start focusing on growth, creativity, and connection with people who reciprocate energy instead of draining it. Life becomes calm, not empty, but full of meaning that isn't tied to chaos. To the narcissist, this indifference feels like defeat. But to the empath, it feels like liberation. It's the proof that healing has occurred, that the wounds have turned into wisdom. The empath doesn't need to announce their peace. It radiates naturally. And that quiet confidence is something the narcissist can neither imitate nor destroy. In the end, indifference is not about shutting down, it's about rising above. It's choosing to no longer feed what was never worth your energy. It's the understanding that silence speaks louder than any defense, that peace is louder than chaos, and that freedom is found not in reacting, but in simply walking away. Indifference doesn't say, I don't care about anything. It says, I care about myself enough not to be controlled by this anymore. And in that choice lies the truest form of power the empath will ever hold. Healing shifts the balance of power. It's the moment when everything that once felt heavy begins to lighten, when pain stops being a weapon and starts becoming wisdom. For the empath, healing is not about forgetting what happened. It's about reclaiming the parts of themselves that were buried beneath manipulation, fear, and exhaustion. For so long, the narcissist's control depended on the empath's unhealed wounds, their need to be seen, their fear of abandonment, their belief that love must be earned. But once the empath begins to heal, those wounds stop bleeding. And with that, the narcissist's power starts to fade. The control that once felt so suffocating suddenly loses its grip. Healing, in essence, reverses the flow of energy. In the toxic dynamic between empath and narcissist, the power has always been an illusion. The narcissist appeared powerful only because the empath kept giving time, forgiveness, understanding, and emotional validation. The empath's openness was used against them, their kindness mistaken for weakness. But when the empath begins the journey of healing, they start to understand something crucial. Power does not come from control over others, it comes from control over oneself. Healing teaches them to redirect their focus inward, to stop trying to fix others and start nurturing their own spirit. This shift is quiet yet monumental. It changes everything about how they engage with the world. The narcissist senses this change almost immediately. They feel the energy shifting, the emotional supply diminishing. What once worked, guilt trips, false affection, threats, suddenly stops landing. The empath's responses become shorter, calmer, more self-assured. The narcissist feels it before they can name it. The spell is breaking. That unspoken energy of dependency begins to dissolve, and with it goes their ability to control. Healing creates distance, not just physical but emotional, a space where the narcissist can no longer reach. The empath, through healing, learns to see beyond the illusion. They begin to recognize how their empathy had been used as a tool against them, how their desire to understand had been twisted into submission. Healing brings awareness, and awareness brings power. Every time the empath chooses to pause instead of react, to reflect instead of explain, they reclaim a piece of themselves. Every act of self-care becomes an act of defiance against manipulation. The narcissist no longer occupies the center of their emotional universe. They are simply a memory, a lesson, a past chapter. The balance of power shifts further when the empath realizes they don't need closure from the narcissist. Closure, they discover, doesn't come from the person who hurt them, it comes from within. The empath learns that peace is not something given, it's something chosen. They begin to let go of the why questions, the endless search for understanding someone who was never willing to be understood. Healing silences those questions because the answers no longer matter. What matters now is freedom, authenticity, and peace. This healing doesn't just transform the empath, It exposes the narcissist. Without emotional chaos to feed on, the narcissist is left with their own emptiness. The empathy they once manipulated now becomes a mirror reflecting their lack of growth. As the empath rises, the narcissist's reality begins to crumble. They can no longer sustain the illusion of power without the energy that once fueled it. They become restless, frustrated, and lost, while the empath becomes centered, grounded, and self-assured. The shift is no longer emotional, it's energetic. The empath vibrates on a different frequency, one that the narcissist cannot reach. Healing also changes the empath's perception of love. They realize that true love isn't about sacrifice or suffering. It's about safety, balance, and mutual respect. They start setting boundaries, not as a reaction to pain, but as a natural expression of self-worth. The empath learns to say no without guilt, to rest without apology, to speak without fear. This newfound confidence makes them immune to the kind of manipulation that once controlled them. The narcissist may try to re-enter their life, sensing the loss of power, but the empath no longer responds. The dynamic that once defined them simply no longer exists. As healing deepens, the empath transforms pain into purpose. They may begin helping others through similar journeys, turning their scars into wisdom. They no longer see themselves as broken, but as reborn. Every lesson learned becomes a tool for growth. Every wound becomes a story of survival. The narcissist fades into irrelevance because the empath no longer identifies with that version of themselves, the one who tolerated what they didn't deserve. The empath becomes stronger, not because of the narcissist, but despite them. And that's where the balance of power truly shifts. The narcissist, who once seemed untouchable, is now powerless. They thrive only in chaos, and healing denies them that environment. The empath, once drained, now radiates an energy that cannot be controlled. Their peace becomes their armor, their self-respect their shield. The narcissist can no longer manipulate what no longer needs them. That realization is the narcissist's downfall and the empath's ultimate victory. Healing doesn't just break the bond, it rewrites the story. The empath no longer sees themselves as the one who was fooled or used, but as the one who awakened. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes proof of resilience, and in that quiet, powerful transformation, the scales tip. The narcissist loses what they can't live without, control. The empath gains what they were always meant to have, freedom. That is how healing shifts the balance of power. It doesn't just end the old story, it begins a new one where the empath finally stands tall, unshaken, and whole. Peace is the narcissist's punishment. It sounds poetic, almost too simple, yet it carries a truth sharper than revenge. The narcissist thrives in noise, in chaos, arguments, attention, drama. That's their element, their sustenance. They need emotional intensity the way a fire needs oxygen. When the empath finally finds peace, when they stop reacting, stop defending, stop explaining, the narcissist begins to suffocate in silence. That silence, that calm, is what truly destroys them. It's not the angry words, the confrontation, or the exposure. It's the quiet detachment, the absolute peace that no longer feeds their ego. To a narcissist, peace is emptiness. To the empath, it's rebirth. The empath's peace doesn't arrive immediately. It's earned. It comes after battles fought within the soul, after nights spent questioning their worth, after walking away from the need to be understood. For so long, the empath thought that winning meant making the narcissist see their pain, acknowledge the damage, or show remorse. But peace doesn't come from the narcissist's apology. It comes from realizing that none of that was ever necessary. Peace comes when the empath no longer seeks justice in chaos. They stop replaying conversations, stop wondering what they could have done differently. They realize that the narcissist's behavior was never about them. It was about control, and the only real freedom lies in no longer being a part of that system. The narcissist, however, cannot comprehend this kind of peace. They perceive silence as rejection, calmness as defiance. To them, indifference is unbearable because it reflects their deepest fear, irrelevance. The narcissist needs to be the center of someone's emotional universe, even if it's through pain. When the empath stops playing, stops reacting, stops caring, the narcissist faces something they've spent their whole life running from, their own emptiness. They begin to crumble because there's no one left to project onto, no one left to manipulate, no one left to validate their false image. Peace then becomes the empath's most powerful weapon, not because it hurts, but because it neutralizes. It doesn't retaliate, it doesn't seek to destroy, it simply removes energy. It's the purest form of detachment. The narcissist can scream, provoke, pretend, or plead, but the empath no longer bends. That stillness becomes impenetrable. It says without words, you no longer have power here. The narcissist, once the puppet master, finds himself dancing alone, strings cut, ego starving. For the empath, peace feels like coming home. It's the first breath after years of suffocation. They begin to realize that peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the absence of control. It's waking up without the weight of someone else's moods dictating their day. It's smiling without guilt, resting without apology, existing without fear. It's the rediscovery of self, the rebirth of joy that isn't dependent on another's approval. And this peace doesn't just protect them, it transforms them. The empath becomes a version of themselves that the narcissist can no longer recognize. Strong, grounded, self-assured. The beauty of peace is that it doesn't need to announce itself. It's quiet, steady, and unshakable. It doesn't seek revenge, because revenge would mean giving energy again. Instead, peace operates like sunlight, gentle but powerful, burning away the shadows of manipulation. The narcissist may try to re-enter, sensing their loss, testing if the door is still open. But the empath, now rooted in peace, simply observes without emotion. There's no anger left, no need to prove anything. They've risen above the game entirely. And that, more than anything, is what drives the narcissist mad. The narcissist cannot survive where peace exists, because peace exposes their chaos. It shows them what real strength looks like: calm, consistent, unapologetic. The empath doesn't have to speak of what they've endured. Their serenity says it all. Every smile, every moment of quiet confidence is a silent message: you no longer matter. This is not cruelty, it's balance being restored. The narcissist is left to face the one thing they cannot manipulate: themselves. In this stage, the empath understands something profound, that the greatest revenge is not revenge at all. It's happiness, it's joy that no longer needs permission, it's freedom from the emotional roller coaster that once defined them. The empath learns to thrive, to love again, but differently, healthily, without fear. They stop looking for intensity and start valuing peace. They realize that real love feels like safety, not confusion, like comfort, not chaos. And in embracing that truth, they ensure they will never fall into the same trap again. The narcissist, meanwhile, is left haunted by the peace they can't possess. They'll search for new supply, new attention, new validation, but something about this loss feels different, because this time the empath didn't leave with anger. They left with silence. And silence to the narcissist is unbearable. It represents finality, something they cannot undo. They might rewrite the story, paint themselves as the victim, or pretend they never cared, but deep down they feel it. The shift. The one who once fed their ego now feeds their own soul. The narcissist becomes invisible to the very person they once controlled. In the end, peace is not just the empath's healing, it's the narcissist's undoing. It's the energy that cannot be faked, the calm that cannot be disturbed. It's the full circle moment where the empath realizes they were never weak. They were learning strength disguised as survival. Now that strength has become serenity. Peace becomes their power, and in that power, the narcissist disappears, starved of attention, stripped of illusion. That's how peace becomes the ultimate punishment, not through pain, but through freedom. Because nothing destroys the narcissist more than seeing the empath finally, beautifully, at peace.